Hey, what's going on, guys? In this video, I wanted to bring you everything you need to know to go to any river system in the country that has a major walleye run and catch fish no matter what stage of the run those fish are in. I did not always have this knowledge. As a matter of fact, 5 or 6 years ago when I started, I would go with guys in the same boat and they would outfish me 10 to 1. The boats around me would all be hauling in fish and I just couldn't catch them. But since then, I have learned a ton and I'm hoping to pass all that knowledge on to you guys in this video. I'm going to be covering walleyes and saugers as well. They're pretty much lumped into the same category as far as I'm concerned. So let's get started with kind of the location and seasonal movement as those fish move up the river so you know where to look, and then we'll get into the presentations. So early in the season, before the fish have really started to think about spawning, they're just staging, they're starting to move a little bit. Ice has just gone out. We've got water temps in the upper 30s, maybe mid to upper 30s, pushing 40. That's when you're still gonna find most fish fairly deep. And deep is a relative term. Depending on what river system you're fishing in, what area of the river, deep could be 12 feet, it could be 30 feet. But typically the deepest water that you find is where they're gonna hang out, or at least real close to it. And they will slide up a little bit on the edges once in a while, especially morning and evening, but they're typically gonna stay in that deeper water. And big pools below dams, big pools on bends and outside bends, any deep channels going through an area with slow current. That's the other part. These fish are not cold water fish. Walleyes and saugers are warm water fish. Their metabolism has not kicked in yet when the water is this cold, and they don't want to be fighting current if they don't have to. So to find them, you're going to look for A, deep water, and B, some sort of an eddy or current break. And that can come in the form of a wing dam, that can come in the form of a trench in the bottom of the river where those walleyes can get down and the current goes over the top of them. It can come in the form of a point or an outside bend that blocks the current and pushes it around to the outside of a bend. Anywhere there's a current break, and typically you're going to want to get close to the current or close to the seam of that current. The walleyes aren't typically going to sit way back in the slack water where there's zero current, but they're going to be close to the edge. That way they can get into that current and move quickly if they want to escape or grab a meal, but they're resting in that slower stuff. So, and keep in mind, if there's a hump or a wing dam or some sort of structure, there will be some slack water upstream of that as well as downstream. So walleyes will sit on both sides of that structure. So that's some great places to look. All right, now as we move on towards the 40-degree temps, like the low 40s, 40 to 45 degrees, you get some runoff, the river starts to come up a little bit. We're gonna start seeing walleyes push a little bit shallower, and they're gonna start pushing up towards where they're gonna spawn. So they're gonna start heading to spawning areas like below dams, gravel flats, areas that they're gonna have some current that's gonna flow over the eggs and wash them and keep them oxygenated. They're gonna especially move into those areas at night. So really now is the time to start fishing shallower and shallower morning and evening, and we can fish a little bit more current as well. Those fish aren't quite as shy from that current. They'll start pushing up there, like I said, in the mornings and the evenings. You start seeing more females show up at that mid 40s range. The first fish that show up are typically males in that early stage. The spawning progression is definitely not a singular event. Fish will move in waves, they'll follow that deep water up, then they'll come out and disperse and spawn, and then they'll move back out to the lake. So this happens over and over as waves of fish come through. So it's not necessarily a perfect science, but this is just kind of a typical scenario that you'll find. All right, as we move on, getting into those mid 40s to upper 40s, pushing 50, those fish are spawning 100%, and they will be flooding into shallow gravel and rock areas at night especially. And typically you're not going to see as many fish out on those deeper spots in the deeper bites. Now is the time when you can catch them from shore much easier. You don't necessarily have to have a boat. Full-blown spawn, and it's on pretty much in shallow water everywhere on these river systems. Now as the spawn peters out, you're going to see fish start to move back down out to the mouth of the river, back out to the lake, so you can start fishing the edges of those deeper holes and start fishing the actual mouth of the river as those fish start to filter out. And again, it's not all going to happen at once. It's not like the river's just going to empty and all the fish are going to go back to the lake. It's stages of fish moving through and cycling through. So a lot of these bites happen simultaneously when it's really going hard and there's a good runoff and temps are warming up. There'll be fish moving up, there'll be fish going back out, there'll be fish spawning, and it can really be a bite almost anywhere. So that's kind of a basic overview of how walleyes progress through the spawning run from start to finish and where to find them. So now let's get into some specific techniques that you can use at those different stages that work really, really well. All right, guys, let's talk presentation. Going back to that early season deep water bite, when the fish are a little more sluggish and they're in that slower water, kind of along the seams of the current like we talked about, I'm going to use a couple different things. Number one being a jig and plastic. Now this presentation, I'm going to have tied on the whole walleye run from beginning to end. I'm just going to vary the size of my jig. So starting out early, we're going to use a heavy jig, typically 3/8 to 1 ounce. And the plastic we're going to use just has to have action in slow conditions. So it has to have a tail that's activated even at slow speeds, because we're fishing this at a really slow pace for these fish that are in this colder water. So the Crush City Mayor, I've found paddles really well in a slow moving situation. It's got a really good thump to it, so I've had great luck on that particular plastic this season. This is just a 3-inch in like a chartreuse pearl color. Been a great bait this season, but you can use all kinds of different plastics. You can use the ringworm style, more the bee fish and tackle style with the ribs on it. There's all kinds of them that work, as long as the action will work in slow moving situations. Now the jig itself, I've been having so much fun using these VMC tungsten moon eyes. You can feel the bottom better, it telegraphs to the rod better, and it falls a little quicker for its size, so you can get away with a little smaller jig head. Amazing difference between these and lead. So I will leave all this stuff linked below, by the way, in the description if you want to pick it up, but definitely check those out. If you're in a real snaggy situation, you might want to stick with lead, because these are a little bit more pricey jigs, but if you're not snagging up, great option. So 3/8 ounce to 1 ounce jig, depending on how deep and how much current you're fishing. Any kind of plastic that moves in a slower moving situation will work. Now how we're going to work this bait is just a lift fall, about a 12-inch jig, and that's all we're doing. We're just going to lift it up and we're going to follow it back to bottom, and as soon as it hits bottom, you're picking it up again and following it back down. You do not want to let it go slack to the bottom, because the fish will hit it right before it hits the bottom a lot of times, and if you don't have that line tight, you're going to miss the bite. So I just follow it up, follow it down, bottom, follow it up, follow it down, bottom. That's all you got to do. It's a super simple cadence, and it works in this cold water. So that's number one for cold water for me, is a jig and plastic. Now I've got two more that really work well. All right, guys, so here's the second presentation that has been absolutely deadly this year with the lower water conditions, and that is called a Dubuque rig. Now this Dubuque rig is just a mainline down tier 3-way swivel, a leader about 3 or 4 feet long off the back of that to a live minnow, and about a 18-inch leader down to the same jig and plastic that we're using for just pitching plastics, although I typically upsize the weight a little bit to pull that minnow and that extra line. This is a killer rig in clear water and lower water conditions, especially early in the season. That jig will get bit about half to a quarter of the time that live bait will get bit on certain days. A lot of times the fish see that jig coming and they get fired up, but they don't quite hit it. Then that minnow drifts past all natural and they just smoke it. I just crushed them today on this rig. I caught over 50 fish, and most of them came on that minnow. So don't ever discount that rig right there. It gets that live bait down to the bottom, gives you 2 chances to catch fish. Now, one other variation of this is if they're really hot on plastics, you can actually make this leader a little bit longer and shorten this one up. And then you can put 2 plastics on. One will be on the bottom and one will be just slightly above the bottom. And you can just use a lighter jig on that top one, like a 16th ounce jig. And then you can double up your plastics and have twice the the presentation. So you can do one in like a natural color, one in a bright color, give one presentation up above the bottom and one on the bottom. So that is a great way to catch fish. Now, how we're gonna fish this is a little bit different than when we're pitching plastics. When we're pitching plastics, a lot of times we're gonna pitch upstream and kind of work it back down to us. This is a hard rig to cast. So typically with this rig, I'm gonna be pulling it. So depending on how much current there is, if it's a real slow current, I can anchor up, like hit spot lock, and I can actually just bounce it behind the boat and it'll just work perfect. Or if it's real slow, I can slowly move upstream and work it upstream. If it's a little bit faster current, I may have to kind of drift back with it as I go down current and kind of follow it. So it's a really effective combination for A, covering water, and B, presenting two different options to the fish, and it just can be an absolute killer, especially early in the season. So that is setup number 2 for early in the season. All right, guys, my third favorite presentation for walleyes in cold water is the blade bait. This happens to be an Acme V-Rod, which is one of my favorites because it vibrates at a really slow speed. I can just barely pull this thing and it's thumping. And I added a little VMC bladed treble off the back to add a little action to it. And that's actually been a pretty good target for the fish. They've hit that back treble quite a few times. And this one really excels in high water. Whereas the plastic or the Dubuque rig works well in lower clear water, this baby gets the attention of those fish when the water is murky, high, hard for them to see and hear. This thing has a lot of thump and a lot of attraction to it. So we've had some really good days on days where you wouldn't even think the fish could see the bait, but you just get that thing thumping in their face and they can catch it. Again, super cold water, it's also very good. So very, very early in the season can be an excellent presentation. Typically a deeper water presentation too. I don't use a lot of blades under about 10 feet, 15 feet of water, but great in like those 30-foot depths. And I'm gonna fish this pretty similar to how I fish the jig and plastic when I'm pitching plastics. It's just gonna be a lift, just enough to get the blade moving and thumping. You can feel it in the rod tip, just and then fall back to bottom on a tight line. Same thing as that jig, you don't want to let it free fall or you're going to miss bites. And I'll pitch it just like a jig in plastic. I'll pitch it upstream, work it down to myself, or I'll drift with it and just keep picking it up. And fish absolutely love that. And you'll catch all kinds of other stuff on these rigs too. You'll catch white bass, catfish, you know, even carp or big shad. You never know what you're going to catch. So that's my third presentation for early season walleyes in the river systems. All right, guys, now as the season progresses and you start to get fish moving up shallower, again, that jig and plastic is still going to be in my arsenal, but I'm going to go lighter with the jig. So this is a 1/4 ounce VMC Maumee jig and a little bit narrower and thinner maybe with the plastic, depending on the situation. But I really like that Euro Tackle 3-inch B vibe for later in the season. Can be a real killer for pitching up on some of those shallower shelves in areas where those walleyes are moving up. But you can also use the same stuff we talked about in deeper water and just lighten up your jig on it. So, and you're gonna retrieve it the same, but you can also add in some just lifts where you start to pick up the bait and then retrieve it for 3 or 4 feet and then drop it back to bottom. I've found that to be a very effective retrieve when the fish start getting a little more active and more shallow. You can also still do the pick up and drop. And as the water starts to warm even more later in the season, you can start really popping them off the bottom and giving them a rip, and they dart off the bottom and then fall back down, dart off the bottom. So as those fish get more aggressive, you can start using them a little more aggressively. But the jig and plastic will work throughout the whole season. So keep that one tied on all the time. Just go with a little bit lighter jig head as you move shallower. All right, guys, the next presentation as the water warms up that's a blast to fish is some sort of rattle bait or lipless crankbait. This is the Euro Tackle Z Viber, and I believe this is a 1/2 ounce size. Purple Joker is a killer color for walleyes. And again, I'll leave this stuff all linked in the description so you can find it. But that bait is so fun to fish when those fish start moving shallow. Especially, it's a great night bait. Caught a lot of walleyes at night on this when they're up moving into those shallow rocks. So we're just going to pitch it out there and we're just going to jig it. We're basically going to jig this bait off the bottom. We're not going to straight retrieve it. We're going to cast it out there, let it hit bottom, and just pick it up and get it vibrating and jig it a few feet at a time. Just and let it fall back to bottom, back to bottom. And you can start ripping it as the water warms up, especially later on as those fish start moving back out and the water's in the 50s. You can give it more aggressive rips, but it typically works well as sort of a jigging bait. And that's one of my favorite ways to fish kind of those mid to late season walleye run walleyes. Works great in about 2 to 3 feet, all the way down to about 15 feet is about as deep as these are really practical, and they start to get a little bit light to fish much deeper than that. But they work great in current, great at night, and they really get the fish's attention and kind of create those reaction bites, especially if the fish aren't really feeding necessarily. That thing just rips in front of their face and they just smoke it. So that's another great presentation for more of that mid to late season. All right, guys, the last presentation that I really start to add in towards the spawning period when those fish have moved shallow, especially at night, is jerk baits. Jerk baits are absolute classic lures. Lots of guys use these from shore when the walleyes have moved up at night. My favorite three, or my top three, are the Rapala X-Rap, the Husky Jerk, and the Storm Thunderstick. Between those three and maybe the Rapala Original floaters, you're gonna have one that's gonna catch those fish. And I just kind of rotate through them, and it depends on the night or the time of day sometimes, just what the one they're gonna wanna eat. And also you have to vary the retrieve with these. Sometimes a straight retrieve is gonna get you way more bites than putting any action into that bait. Just a slow crank, just enough to keep that thing moving through the water. Other days, a hard snap like you're fishing for smallmouth with that slack line, bam, 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 is gonna get way more bites. So I found at night typically more the steady retrieve works better. In the daytime, the jerk pause retrieve works better. I've got another video all about jerk baits. If you want to see that, I've got a link down below in the description for that video. But definitely don't want to go out to the river mid to late season without your jerk baits, because that can be an absolute killer for those late season walleyes. So that kind of wraps up basically all the presentations that I would use in the river. Now, any time of the year, beginning to end, you can always use a jig and a minnow as well. I just find live bait to be a pain, and if I can avoid it, I do. I definitely use it on those Dubuque rigs, but I just rarely find myself using live bait like a live jig and minnow setup in the river. I just don't think you have to. It's unnecessary and it's just added hassle. You can if you want to, but that's just kind of how I do it, and I've had a lot of luck mainly using artificials. So there you have it, guys. That pretty much covers anything and everything that I know, and hopefully that you need to know to go hit that river walleye run this spring. You know how to catch them, you know where to find them, and hopefully you'll have success. So thanks for watching, guys. Make sure you sub to the channel. Got lots more stuff like this and a lot's coming up in the future. So I'll leave a video for you right here to watch, and we'll catch you next time. Get hooked up.